this particular course unit it feeds off the activities that are involved in ICT design and selection, are basically feed off from a number of activities that we have seen before, especially in ICT strategy and policy. So there are some topics that are basically a repeat. Now, the next session we were supposed to have was on benchmarking, but we did benchmarking when we did strategy and policy. So I thought it would be a waste of time for me to go through that. So what I did was upload those slides on Moodle. I need to send you all the enrollment key for the course unit. I'll do so later this evening or tomorrow morning. So essentially, I'm going to skip that because we did that. We looked at benchmarking and how we can benchmark and the different types of benchmarking and some of the principles. So what I did was just uploaded those slides just to remind us about it. And then today we are going to remind ourselves on ICT strategy because it leads to ICT design, selection and implementation. It's the beginning step for us to go through that. So we're going to remind ourselves of that. What I'm going to do now is to share my screen. And there it is. I hope you can all see the screen. So
you can see it, Doctor.
Okay. So essentially what we want to narrow down to today in our discussion is developing business/information technology strategies. We looked at how to develop ICT strategies, and policy and developing policies. We can have and I want to give you a small assignment, which we can then, after this small assignment, we can as in groups, so that you develop a strategy, and then from there we see how we can begin the points where we can begin to design and implement ICT solutions. Everything follows a specific steps. It's really not a good idea to come up with a solution without understanding the business, the overall business goals and strategies. So we really must start from the strategy side. So for this particular course unit, we want to look at the planning process. And the plan, and we discussed this when we did ICT strategy and policy. Essentially what it is planning. It's part of the planning process, specifically focusing on information technology. Now, the thing that is slightly new is the role of business models, because business models are extremely important in the planning process. When we looked at strategy, one of the key points we want to focus on, one of the key points any business wants to focus on is essentially value creation. And that's what a business model is. It creates that blueprint, that map, which shows where the value is being created. And therefore, the information technology, an ICT head or the ICT department knows exactly where to pinpoint information technology, essentially to bring about that value creation or to support value creation. We shall look at change management solutions slightly. We have seen them, so I will not go much into them because we discussed this when we were doing ICT strategy. And then we shall we have already understood the importance of aligning IT alignment. We have seen that. So some of these things are essentially just a repeat. But for us to understand where ICT design, selection, and implementation will emerge from. So let's first look at planning. And then we ask ourselves, what is planning? Since we have looked at strategy, we understand what planning essentially is. So essentially, when we're looking at planning, we're looking at preparing ourselves to achieve a certain goal. Any planning process one goes through The intention is to achieve something. When we look at ICT, ICT is not valued in it by itself, but it must be there to achieve some objective. So a map essentially is, a plan essentially is a map. So when we look at a strategy, when we look at business models, these are all plans. Essentially, that's what they are, plans. So in the planning process one, we begin by identifying our goals and objectives. Just give me a minute, please. I have my young nephew making noise here. Give me a minute. Many apologies for that disruption. I have a very young nephew in the house, and yeah, he demands to be given attention. So, so what is the planning process? What does it involve? It involves goals and objectives. So we already saw this when we're looking at strategy. Now, in those goals and objectives, this is when we begin to see the ICT needs, what applications are needed. And when we remind ourselves in a few minutes on the process of developing a strategy, you will see where we actually pinpoint the technology architecture, the application architecture. We will see that, and this is where we begin to identify what technologies we need. Sometimes, and also even in the policies, in ICT policies, we actually specify the policies that guide exactly how a design of ICT instances must be handled. Well, if it's going to be in-house, if it is outsourced, whatever it is, you find that in a policy. So when we look at planning, we've seen this before. When we look at planning at organizational level, we essentially, we are identifying the organization's goals and objectives. And we do that essentially by starting with the mission and vision statements, what the organizational goals and objectives are. We have seen this before. So it's nothing new. From these the organizational goals, strategies are then developed. Strategies, policies, and tactics are then developed. These are done by, of course, there's a team building model. There's a team that actually does this. And this team will not just look at the organizational goals, but then we'll study the environment, the organizational environment. We look at the external developments. We look at the resources that are available, so that when they develop the strategies, they know exactly what is available for them, to be able to achieve the goals, they want to develop. From the strategies and policies, you begin implementation. Now, this is where ICT design, selection, and implementation comes in, because the strategies and policies are the beginning point. They tell us what we need, or they guide us on what is it we need to develop. What ICT do we need implemented? You look at a university, for instance. Therefore, to have e-learning, e-learning technologies, they become extremely important because they help you achieve those goals. Finance, ICT technologies, and so on and so forth. Already by just looking at the needs of the organization, you see what technologies need to be done. But however, when it is aligned to strategy, then truly it's aligned to developing the organizational goals that the organization desires to achieve. And at that point, ICT then begins to make sense to management and to all others and to all stakeholders. The other organizational types of planning, you have strategic planning, you have tactical planning. We've been through this, so I will not really repeat them. You have operational planning. I won't go into that, but let's focus on IT strategy, yeah? Because we just to remind ourselves. So we start with what is IT strategy or ICT strategy. So we already know this. These are essentially interventions that are geared at using ICT to help deliver value. Now, these words are keywords because later on they make sense. They'll help us understand why business models come in. So the IT capabilities, we want to use IT to deliver value. So in the strategy, we are essentially saying we want to ensure that our IT capabilities can help us deliver value. You understand what IT is needed, what IT is not needed. There might be an assumption that I want the biggest, baddest server that could exist, but that's essentially not a requirement. I remember when we were starting to go online at UMU, and it was when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. Of course, management was asking questions, and you get all sorts of salespeople now coming in and throwing things at you. And that time, as head ICT, of course, there was the question of what tools do we truly need as UMU? And we had to do a lot of benchmarking with other universities and so on and so forth. And eventually we came to the conclusion that no, we don't actually need the biggest server in the world for learning. We realized that the heaviest traffic is in these online classes. But when it comes to where the model where we basically deposit our content, the traffic isn't that big. So it's actually not really necessary. As we go on now, I'm not really part of ICT. As we go on, some of the things that we see that I observe that are extremely important are things like a reliable service provider, or internet service provider, just small observations. But it's not necessary that we should have the biggest server. And sometimes you end up clashing with certain stakeholders who are insisting, let's have the biggest server. And you're saying, no, we don't actually, the ICT is saying, no, you actually don't need the biggest server. So it's trying to look at those things that can help the organization deliver value. So the IT strategy, the ICT strategy defines how IT will be used to help a business win its chosen business context. So it's also a living document because it has an expiry date, and it's renewed. Like anything, it's renewed. It must have time when it's renewed, pruned. Like for us here where we do farming, we have a time when you have your agriculture product, when something is productive. We are in tea here, and so we divide our tea into numbers, and we keep monitoring how much does this number give us during the rainy season, during the dry season, what is its height? Then you know if it's getting low in productivity, then we need to prune it so that it's renewed in growth. And the tea that comes after pruning is something that is really good quality tea. And that time we always want to showcase it at the factory where we deliver. So it's also the same thing with the ICT strategy document, and together with the policy. This is a living document. It must exist as long as it's productive. Once it's no longer productive, then you must go back and prune it. You must go back and renew it, revisit it. we are going to just remind ourselves with a classic approach to ICT strategy development. Like I said, we have covered most of these topics before. We just want to see where we begin to emerge with ICT design and implementation. So the first classic step is when we identify the business capabilities. And these, we want to know what are the capabilities of this organization between now for a certain period of time. What do we have to help us achieve our organizational strategy and vision? Then we assess the gap. What is needed? What do we need to, what is lacking that needs to be filled up so that we can achieve our required goals? We identify the technologies that can be used to address those gaps. Then we design our targeted technology architecture. Now, this is the key point, with the targeted technology architecture. So because this is where we begin to identify my apologies once again. My network seems to be shaky. Let me just share again. So many apologies. My network seems to be a bit shaky. I've just put my phone there to act as a support in case something goes off. So basically, in the process, when we begin to identify the gaps, we want to point out what is our desired technology architecture. And we assess also the gaps. What gaps exist that are not assisting us achieve our desired architecture. And when we assess those gaps, that's when we realize what technology we need. What ICT do we need to select or implement? Then we prioritize the roadmap for building the desired targeted technology architecture. Now, I hope you begin to realize where we begin the process of ICT design, selection, and implementation. So when we look at the classical approach for developing ICT strategy, you notice the pillars that build it: application strategy, integration, infrastructure, service, sourcing. Yeah. So each of these points are a guiding tool for ICT design, each of them. When we look at application strategy, what you're doing is you're looking at those IT applications that will support the business strategies. What applications are needed? So in your strategic analysis, you determine what applications you need, what applications do you have, and what don't you have. That's one point. You look at integration. How should these applications interact with one another in order to support the business processes? That's another key point. Infrastructure strategy. What infrastructure do you need? Where do you need to make an investment to get the most cost-effective as well as the most robust infrastructure that you could have? Service strategy. So this one looks at the organization's customers. How will you deliver service to them? So the service level, of course, one is looking at those who directly are receiving customers of the organization, but also internally, how does ICT provide services to the internal organization, who would also be the IT or the ICT customers? Sourcing, now, this part of sourcing determines whether you build things in-house or whether you depend on other providers. Of course, when we look at organizations, you realize that for all the things that you need, you're not going to do things yourself. This is practically not possible. So you must have a strategy on how you're going to deal with both. How you're going to deal with both cases, you must have that strategy. Of course, depending on your capabilities as an organization. So we have seen this diagram before. I really won't go much into it, but what we are focusing on is the process of planning out our ICT strategy. Like I said before, we have gone through it. We don't want to repeat what we have already done before. When we're still looking at, okay, we have looked at the classical approach. We also have the scenario approach, but this one looks at using teams to create a micro world. So essentially, what happens in a business? You have different scenarios, and these scenarios, of course, will exist maybe in finance, in HR, in the marketing department, and so on and so forth. So all these scenarios are created by teams, and these scenarios help to give the department, the ICT department, an understanding of what currently exists and also what is needed. It is at this point where the needs and requirements are spelled out. So this is just an example of what may come out from a scenario group. Now, for example, let's say finance sits and then they begin to pinpoint what their needs are, what currently exists. And then they also begin to prioritize what is the most important thing that we need. And they begin to state which is of the highest priority, which is medium, which is the lowest priority. So there you see what impact this may have on the farm, that if we handle this fast, this will have the highest impact on gaining value. Now, when we have developed a strategy, like we discussed when we came to this topic, there is implementation of the strategy. When we discussed it, I'm sure we must have looked at situations where a strategy may just remain on paper. I don't remember if it was in this class where I told a story. I one time went for a workshop with Reno where we met with different ICT heads. And I remember one particular one was talking to me and he was very proud and he was telling me how he had developed a policy and so on and so forth. But he said, most people don't know that I've even developed, and he was really very proud. And it was at the tip of my tongue to tell him that if nobody knows you have a policy, then what is its purpose? It's useless. Now, it's the same thing with the strategy, where strategy and policy go hand in hand. It must be implemented. So for most strategies, implementing a strategy, it poses a threat, especially to some employees. Most people don't like change. So there are steps to strategy implementation. Now, when you're implementing a strategy, obviously the specified activities or tactics, whatever it is you've spelled out, must come to fruition. If it's an ICT strategy, that means there are going to be changes. There are basically going to be changes that are coming up. New technology is going to be used. New ways of doing things are going to be introduced. And this automatically brings resistance. Now, of course, not all resistance is bad. Some resistance must be listened to. There are valid points that can be raised. But if the strategy policy process was done together with everyone participating, then there shouldn't be a reason to resist. The other reasons that may come may actually be may be detrimental. I think, let me just give me a minute. I first change Okay, sorry about that. I just changed my connection so that I think my router is not stable at the moment. So one, what are some of the steps that we can take to implement strategy? One is to plan with the potential of implementing you must have a plan for implementing the strategy. So the plan essentially would be stating what areas of priority, where should you start, which step, what should you start with, what should you end with, and who is responsible. So this is the strategic leadership. Who is responsible for that? If there are certain resources that are needed to make implementation, make sure these resources are available. That's why ICT strategy is done in teams, and management is part of these teams, and what part of management is finance. So those resources are extremely important. It becomes very bad when management says we need to make a change with applications being made, but finance is not releasing those funds, which is quite common. Create encouraging policies. That means policies that motivate, that encourage those who are implementing, that they are not going to lose their jobs. There should be incentives for those ones who make an effort to take on the new implementations, and so on and so forth. Now, here, I think this is a little bit small, but it's uploaded on Moodle. You'll find it. We want to see how we want to do this in groups. If we can do this in a group, I've put up a background of Aristoc Booklets Limited, which was founded in 1991. There is a need for Aristoc to go online. That need, you can read through it. I won't go through it. You can take your time and read through it. There is a need for Aristoc. Sorry, apologies once again. My network is very shaky today. So,
Doctor, we do understand. It is fine.
Okay. So, Aristoc wants to become a leading online store in Uganda. Can you come up with an ICT strategy that will help Aristoc realize this dream? Come up with a schedule of projects that Aristoc Booklets should undertake to realize this goal. So let's have that discussion. If we can do that, because I know you're submitting, you have another assignment. We can agree on the submission date when you can present this work. Let's now look at business models. Now, the business model is, I don't know if you've met it in the other modules that you've done, but business models are something that I encountered when I was doing my PhD, and specifically I looked at mobile application business models. But essentially what they are is a conceptual framework. It's a conceptual framework, and it's essentially logic. It's expressing the economic logic of a certain business. Everything has logic. If we think about everything, if you look at your body system, it has a logic. The way your brain works, the respiratory system, and so on and so forth. The concept of a human being has its logic. If you look at the ecosystem, there is a logic to it. The minute you remove something from that ecosystem, you disrupt that logic. So everything around us has logic. Therefore, also, when a business comes, and any business that exists, it must have a logic. There must be a system. And when you look at a business model, it doesn't just look at the organization, it looks at everything, it looks at all the stakeholders, it looks at, it's actually explaining it's expressing the vision that is expected. But primarily what it does, it expresses value. What value needs to be delivered, yeah? what value needs to be delivered. Now, for some people, some of you may not be in the private sector. Some of you may be in government or NGOs where you're not necessarily looking at economic value. Well, it's also possible to have a business model which is looking at generating social value. Specifically, this was something for me where I had to get an existing business model, the business model concepts, and switch it so that it delivers social value, because I was looking at rural development. So if that value doesn't necessarily have to be economic, but primarily, of course, business models are from an economic background. So normally, most business model toolings that exist, we have business model tools or toolings, those that exist, they help to showcase economic value. But like I said, we can switch it to social value depending on the current industry that you are looking at. So it's the business model will express how a business will organize and operate. Then it focuses on the essential components that fit to complete a system. Basically, it looks at everything that is needed to help one produce value. Now, interestingly, when I was doing the business model tooling that I used, it was called STOF, which is Service Technology Organization and Finance Model. It looked at developing a successful or financially successful mobile application. It even went further and helped you develop a technology architecture. So you knew exactly which tools you need to use to develop your mobile application. So some business models have even developed up to that point. It's just for us to look at what has been developed by the academic world and see what tool to use. Now, when we look at e-business itself, this is what I'm asking you to do as far as the restock assignment is concerned. When we look at e-business, because essentially when ICT comes in, we're essentially saying we want to go we want to go look at e-business, whether it's e-learning or e-health or whatever it is, we are going electronic. Now, when we are looking at e-business planning, we are looking at three major components. We are looking at what strategy do we need to use? What strategy do we need to develop? Resource management, what resources do we have and how can we use them effectively? Then the technology architecture that we need to develop. Those are the three components that we need to look at. So we start, of course, with the strategy, because the strategy tells us what goals we need to achieve. So when you look at the resource management, we're looking at what we have available to us as an organization in terms of, and this resource means it's looking at HR, what ICT personnel do you have, what capabilities do they have, are they able to handle what we need to achieve? You look at the internal organization. If we bring in this new technology, can this organization handle? Things like that. I remember, and particularly for me, I remember one time I was talking to my niece about bringing in ICT into the tea estate. And when she was excited because she's a graduate of IT. But when she told the person that she works with, immediately he said, "I think you'll be taking me out." And immediately I realized, no, this was not a good idea, because quite a good number of our staff, although they may have some level of literacy and some level of education, they may not be really IT literate, and they're essential, extremely essential. You need them for certain things. So you realize on certain aspects, ICT may not be a good idea, because the resource in terms of HR that you have may not be available. Then when you look, of course, at other things, our ICT infrastructure, just connectivity alone is a nightmare here. So when we look at the strategy itself, in the strategy, we have seen this before, what we focus on. We look at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities. Then from there, we determine the business processes. What business processes are going to be translated into e-business processes. So you can also think back to the assignment I've just given you on Aristoc. Which parts need to be to go online? Which parts of Aristoc need to go online? And you can even look at other bookstores which went online. What parts went online and what parts did not? Now, from the business processes, then we determine our application architecture. What applications do we need? Then from there, we determine our technology infrastructure. So that is basically the logic of e-business planning, how we would get onto the e-business planning. And from there, we determine what ICT we need to design. We actually begin to make a design process there. Now, in the ICT architecture itself, because this is where the design process begins, what are the major components? Number one, what platform are we going to use? What technology platform is going to be needed? Yeah, what platform is going to be needed by the customers? What platform is going to be used internally? What platform will be used for our suppliers, and so on and so forth? The data resources, what data is going to be used, and how are we going to handle this data? Application architecture. Now, with data, one of the key points for me that I think is key is to understand which data is our key resource. Yeah, which data is our key resource? I remember when we at UMO, when we began to talk about Zivasti, that was the time it actually came to light that UMO's biggest resource is results. It's not finance, it's results. Because you as students, what you're looking for are your results. So that's an extremely important resource, data resource. It's much more important than the another. The other thing is content, the content that we teach. That is extremely important because it's from the content that you gain your results. So it's looking at the organization and finding out what data is important. Then what applications are you going to use? What application? So it's essentially application architecture. Then the IT organization. That is, what do you currently have? What do you need? How does ICT need to be arranged or rearranged for that matter? Do you need more personnel? Do you need to beef up the training of your ICT personnel? How do we rearrange the organizational structure? Do you need now a database manager where you didn't need one before? Seeing those questions come in. Now, at every university before COVID-19, the term e-learning administrator didn't exist. Now, in every university, an e-learning administrator is a key point. That word didn't exist before. That one I can assure you all. But once you even looked at the papers, the job adverts, universities were advertising for an e-learning administrator. So already that in itself, by almost switching to the online, switching its teaching and learning process online, already a position was required, an e-learning administrator. Do we have any questions so far?
No.
Okay. I hope I'm making sense. Huh?
Doctor, yes, you're making sense. There's a miracle that is happening. So perhaps that's why people are quiet.
Okay.
But we won't say it. We'll say it next week.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Now, when we are implementing e-business, because this is a change that is coming through, this is essentially a change that is coming through, and this is where change management, which we looked at when we were looking at strategy, where change management comes in. It's a change that is coming through. So as you're implementing e-business, you're essentially going to encounter some challenges. The first is the business processes. Just imagine how many lecturers at UMU are happy with teaching online. How many lecturers are actually teaching, happy about it? I can assure you there are many that are not. There are some who are happy, there are some who are not. We went as staff members, we went through extensive training. We were really lucky that we had an ongoing project called TESIA. And this year before COVID-19 came in, and they had been looking at restructuring or rethinking the teaching and learning processes. And essentially they focused, one of the things they focused on was using ICT. So this was before COVID hit. Now, when COVID hit, of course, they came in and they've done quite a lot of extensive training to teach, to boost the skills of the teaching and learning stuff. Now, the other thing is, imagine that the masters may be happy with going, master's students may be happy with it, but a lot of undergraduate students are not happy. Why? Because for them going to a campus and that social element that comes with the learning, with meeting your peers and going out and drinking and dancing and so on and so forth, that essentially has been cut out by going online. That isolation from your social peers is something they are not extremely happy with. So you can imagine.
For us, we are very comfortable.
Yeah. For masters, it's okay, but for the undergraduates, they're not happy with it. I have a nephew. For him, he will create any excuse under the sun, if possible, if he could just go back to Ngozi campus. But of course, we all know why he wants to go back. But it's essentially any business process that you're changing, it's going to have, there are some challenges that will come with it. There are certain things that the way you used to do, we all want to do things the way we previously wanted to do them. The organizational structure. I already gave you an example. In the IT department, we automatically needed an e-learning administrator, a position that didn't exist before. Now you realize the management role, the managerial roles. The key point of management as we're going in online, the role they played was extremely important. The need to embrace online learning. So management becomes extremely important. Employee assignments, employee work assignments. Now, because you're doing something different, it becomes a little bit of a challenge. Fulfilling certain activities. Now, interestingly, I was reading an article on the BBC. Since the lockdowns happened, quite a number of things switched to online work. Now, when the lockdowns began to ease up, this has been viewed in the US and in the UK, where they are recalling people to come back and report to office. And some staff members actually saying no. They don't want to, because they found when they're working from home, the whole point of commuting, moving from one point to the next, going through early morning jam and so on and so forth, it's quite cumbersome. So employees are now saying that essentially you want to hover over us, you don't trust us, you don't think I will fulfill my assignment if I'm online. But it can also happen the other way, that somebody may not be properly supervised when they are online. That possibility may happen, that certain work assignments may not be properly supervised. Stakeholder relationships, So this can also be affected by e-business implementation. Especially your customers, if you're meeting your customers online and you're not seeing people face-to-face, the point of seeing people face-to-face is key. Why? When we look at each other face-to-face, we understand each other a bit more. If you're seeing me, if you may not see me now, you're not looking at me, maybe I am extremely emaciated, maybe I'm extremely stressed. Maybe you yourself are in a bad position, yeah? Maybe you have a patient, maybe you didn't eat something today. I haven't looked at you, you haven't looked at me. So we can spend a whole year without seeing each other. But you are a stakeholder in UMU, just as I am a stakeholder. So managing something online, managing those relationships online can be a little bit tricky because we don't have that face-to-face communication or interaction. Now, one of the key points as you're implementing e-business strategies is to handle end user resistance, because essentially it is the end user who will be affected. Not that we're using the key term end user, because in e-business or anything that's going electronic, the stakeholder becomes an end user, somebody who needs to use the system, yeah, somebody who needs to use the online applications. So one of the things online applications create is fear, yeah, and fear then leads to resistance. Okay, so one is handling fear. How do we handle that fear? One is to have proper training and education. Like I told you at UMU, we had extensive training. Really, I don't know if that TSEA group was not, I don't know what would have done, but they really focused on online training. Now, when I said they were focused on online training, they didn't pull out ICT. I remember that time I was head ICT, they pulled me in, but the training was essentially led by the academic staff, your ordinary lecturer, yeah, the professor, senior lecturer, just a simple person. The ICT people simply came in to show how a certain application works. But the other points of the principles behind online learning, how can you do online assessment, those were essentially done by peers. Yeah. So a lecturer was talking to a lecturer, not an ICT person. An ICT person tends to see things, oh, this is easy, or you just click here, or you know, things like that. But they may not answer the fear of the end user. So it was one end user giving training to another end user. So proper education and training is key. Now here I would advise, as ICT heads, if you're going to handle this training within the organization, try to get other end users to train others. Those who have used a certain application, those who have essentially, if it's an account being trained, let an accountant train the accountant. That for me, I think that is one thing that I saw that truly helps to alleviate that fear. Of course, ultimately, if it's a new application that has not been used, then it may be a key point to say, okay, let's pull out a certain team, it is trained, and that team then goes back to train others. So you still have the end user training the end user. Now, have the end user involved in the change, yeah? So then let the end user be part of the strategic development process. Let them be part and parcel. So end users, so you look at the end users as the stakeholders, the finance person, the marketing person, let there be a representative. Let the marketing department be part of the process of picking out what technologies are needed, what are their requirements. I remember last Friday, I think I gave you a story. A colleague of mine is at Makerere University. Makerere University is looking at developing their own their own system, basically a system to handle finance and registration, the registration process. Maybe it will lead to finance as well. But what my colleague did is he got the stakeholders, those in registry, to come and sit down and say, okay, what do we need? And at the end of it, I remember I talked to him at the end of it. He said this was one, he was talking about his experience, how these people they're able to articulate their needs clearly. And that is that now begins, that means the end user is part of the change. They are defining the change. They're saying this is what we want. So you as ICT, you're basically not coming to impose. Now, we looked at change management. I'm not going to go through it step by step. You can go back and read through it. We looked at it in strategy development. So these are the different phases for change management. You can go through them. I will not repeat what we already looked at. Let us look at ICT life cycle in a company. Now, what do we mean by this? Any ICT that, just like the ICT strategy, this is a living thing. It has a time when it's born and a time when it's either it is renewed or it is buried. Yeah. So before us on this slide, we have our ICT life cycle in a company. And the ICT life cycle starts with the business strategy. Okay. It's from the business strategy that the life cycle of any ICT begins. It is at this point that requirements are clearly stated. Now, these are then articulated in the ICT strategy. Now, from the ICT strategy, we identify our ICT architecture and our ICT organization. Yeah. Those are two key points. Remember when we talked about our technology architecture, we talked about organization, we talked about applications, so on and so forth. Now, from this, we begin to develop our ICT projects. And here, this is what is labeled here as project feasibility. We pick different sections and we create them as projects. Now, here at the farm, what I think of when I look at the farm here, what we do here. At any farm, you have different projects. At one point, you may have, if I just look at the tea industry or a tea estate, you may have the nursery project. And in the nursery project, the key point is to grow those clones that you are going to plant on the tea farm itself, or those clones that you will sell to other tea farmers. That is one project. Then you have the project of planting. If you have a targeted area which has not been planted, you have a project of planting. Now that project has several activities. It will have those who are going to measure the holes. It will have those who are going to plant. And then there will be those after planting, there will be, because before the tea plant grows, you will have that, before it's independent, it will have to be watered in case it's the dry season. Then we determine when we can put a little fertilizer and which type of fertilizer. Then you begin the process. Then you also have the process of maintaining it before it can reach maturity for full plucking. That is another project. Then you have the project of daily plucking. Now, this is the one which generates you income. So you you need your pluckers. Are they properly trained? Do they have supervisors? And so on and so forth. Then you have the different schedules of coming to weigh and so on and so forth. All those are different projects within the tea estate. Now, also within ICT, once you've come up with your strategy, you will have projects in there. Now, each project will have a goal and an objective. Yeah, it will have a goal and an objective. That project will have an analysis. For example, you may have identified that we need an online e-payment system. We need to allow the payment, that we need to transfer this business process online. So you may have the objective may be to capture the online business, and that becomes a project. You identify what you have currently. Do you have, are there any payments online, and what do we need to go online? Then we look at the cost benefit analysis. What is the cost? What cost will we have? What will be the benefits? Then you determine on how you are going to implement that project. Are we going to develop something in-house, or are we going to buy something off the shelf? If we develop something in-house, we have the resources. How quickly can we have it? If you buy off the shelf, can we get something customized to us, to our liking, and so on? That becomes a project. And this is where your project management skills now come in. Yeah. So now you realize, as we are doing this, we're essentially starting the process of ICT design, selection, and implementation. And when you make a decision on what you want to do, you then implement your technology, and then you begin the process of support. Yeah, maintenance and support. Now, if you've looked at the process of even the policy development, the policy itself even also spells out how maintenance of such a system must be done. Yeah. So the project, whatever it is you have developed, you start the maintenance process. And as you do this, you carry out continuous evaluation. As you're carrying out evaluation, while you're doing maintenance and support, you determine if the goals you are intended to have, if you've met them. You also go back to your strategy. Is this system, is this new project helping us achieve our overall objective? Yeah, so that way you're carrying out a continuous evaluation. Now, at the point when you realize it's not, you may decide to come in and do what we in the tea business would say pruning. Where can we tweak? If it's found that it's absolute, then we go back to our strategy and say, do we need to, after a certain period, do we need to change? Do we need to come up with a new strategy, which then takes us back to identifying new ICT architecture, going back to new projects, and so on and so forth. Any questions so far? No?
Doctor, we are so far so good. It is interesting that most of the things we are doing a recap, so you are reminding us of what we had forgotten.
Okay, okay.
Yes, doctor.
So the next slides are basically repeating what I've just said. I basically summarized everything in these few slides. Everything that we've discussed. This is what I discussed. That you can just go through the slides yourselves. Now, you can think about this, and we can discuss this maybe in the next lecture we have, or online. Think about some of these things. And we can have a discussion, and they've just posted some of these questions, and you think about them. Thinking about planning, is it a useless endeavor, so on and so forth. There are times when I remember as ICT would sit down and you make plans. You sit down, and one of the things that I realized is that organizational politics can be really, really bad. There were times we would sit down as ICT, we plan something, we come to present management, we're really fired up and motivated, and somebody simply undercuts your plan. So it can be quite demoralizing, but planning in itself, think about it, and let's have a discussion later on. Planning methods. What would you use to develop an e-business and e-commerce strategy? Look at change management, how you can try to minimize resistance. Then also look at the Prosky change management method. How would you make sure to motivate each phase? So let's just have a discussion on that in our next week on just those topics. You can have time to think about it, and I can post something online where you can give your ideas and you can have a discussion. Do we have any question?
Yes, Doctor.
Yes, please.
Doctor, I'm wondering, you had initially hinted on uploading this material online. I don't know, on Moodle, I don't know if that has been achieved or not yet. Maybe then you might consider sharing the slides with us for now.
Yes, yes. I've actually uploaded them. I just haven't shared with you the enrollment key. I said I'm going to share with this with you probably at the end of this lecture, but they're up online.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that is it. Maybe. What about the recordings? Do you still also upload them, or?
The other one that
What is the different
David shared, I've just shared it with ICT. I've requested them to give me a link, but this one I'm going to share it immediately and ask him to upload it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for your time, Doctor.
Thank you too. I think we've had enough time. We have time to go and listen to the president.
True, true.
Okay.